King Arthur by Jane B. Mason and Sarah Hine Stephens, published by Scholastic. Chapter 1. King Arthur was dead, poisoned by an enemy. Now there was no strong leader to unite the people of Britain. Dark times descended on the country. Knights and barons fought bitterly against one another. Raiders from foreign lands crossed the oceans in great numbers. They killed and enslaved innocent people, burned villages, and claimed the country as their own. Fear loomed over the land like a heavy cloud, darkening everything in its path. While the people suffered and the countryside was ravaged, one man watched quietly: Merlin the Wise. Merlin was as old as Britain itself and had magic running through his veins. He could see the future as easily as another man could remember the past. Although the bloodshed and death in the land saddened him, he knew what was to come. A glorious future awaited Britain and its people. Several months before, on the very day that King Arthur's wife gave birth to the couple's only son, Merlin had gone to the king. King Arthur and Queen Ingrid were overjoyed by the boy's arrival. But their joy did not last long. Merlin had seen the future, and he immediately told Arthur that the good king's death was not far away. "And when you are gone, many will wish to slay your young son," Merlin explained. "But my sight also shows me a way to save the boy. If you will entrust him to me, I shall see that he is educated and well cared for, even as he is hidden from those who wish to do him harm." The king's face paled, but he was a brave man. "If my time is coming, then so be it," he told Merlin. "But I will not allow my son to be killed by the greed and fear of others. Take him, then, and keep him safe." That very night, Merlin bundled up the baby and carried him out of the castle and down a secret path through the darkness. He traveled north for many days and knocked on the door of an old friend, Sir Hector. Sir Hector's wife opened the door. Merlin handed her the baby. Merlin told his friends only that the boy's name was Arthur, and that one day they would know the identity of his birth parents, but not today. Sir Hector and his wife were a kind couple with a 5-year-old son of their own. They happily agreed to look after the orphan child and raise him with love. Merlin left the baby in their care. Then he retired to the valleys and forests of Wales to watch and wait. It was not easy to watch. Wars tore the country apart. Friends turned against one another. Fear lived in everyone's heart. The smell of death and fire lingered in the air. Had Merlin not been a man who understood destiny, he might have brought Arthur out of hiding too soon. Fortunately, Merlin knew how to be patient. By the time Arthur was 16 years old, it seemed all hope of reuniting the country was lost. It was then that Merlin traveled to London to meet with the Archbishop Dubricius. Even though Merlin and the Archbishop were not of the same faith, they had great respect for each other. "I bring good news," Merlin told the Archbishop. "Soon the darkness that envelopes us will disappear, and a true leader will emerge. He will rule over all of Britain as High King. You must gather all of the lesser kings and lords and knights of Britain at your cathedral on Christmas Day." The Archbishop was not entirely sure what Merlin meant, but he knew enough not to question him. He followed the wizard's instructions and sent for the kings and lords and knights. They came from the far corners of Britain and filled the pews of the cathedral. Each of them wondered why he had been summoned. None could have guessed the miraculous events that would come to pass. In the middle of the sermon, a great commotion arose in the cathedral's courtyard. Stepping out into the cold winter air, the lords and their ladies were shocked to see a large piece of marble sitting in the center of the courtyard. On top of the marble was a black anvil. Stuck deep through them both was a glittering sword. The stone, the anvil, and the sword were a shock to all, for they had not been there before the service. Even more surprising was the inscription carved in the golden letters on the stone itself. Whoever draws this sword from the stone is the rightful High King of Britain. There was silence as everyone considered the significance of this inscription. Then the lords and knights began to shove their way forward for a chance to claim the sword and the crown. One after another, they pulled with all their might, but to no avail. The sword did not budge. "We shall try again on New Year's Day," the archbishop told the men. "A great tournament will be held, and afterward you can try the sword a second time." During the following week, knights traveled from far and wide to compete in the jousting tournament and try their hand at removing the sword from the stone. The London inns were filled to capacity, and the roads were crowded with visitors. Among them were Sir Hector and his two sons. Kay, Hector's elder son, had grown up to be a powerfully built young man. He was thickly muscled and a bit thick-headed as well. Newly knighted, the young man was terribly proud of himself and eager to prove his strength and bravery in a joust. He was altogether the opposite of his foster brother. Young Arthur had no intention of competing and no need to prove himself. He was a clever lad and slightly built. Arthur thought it would be years before he was knighted, but he was not anxious. For now he was pleased to watch everything that happened and to serve as Kay's squire. Even though lately the older boy had done nothing but bark orders at him. On the way to the joust, Kay suddenly realized that he'd forgotten his sword. He was about to blame Arthur when Arthur took the blame himself. "I should have made you sure you had it," he confessed. "It's a squire's job to outfit his knight. I will retrieve it and meet you at the south end of the fields." Without another word, Arthur turned back toward the inn to retrieve the weapon. Arthur hurried as quickly as he could, but there were hordes of people in the streets, all heading toward the tournament. The skinny boy felt like a fish swimming upstream. By the time he arrived back at the inn, everyone had left for the tournament. The doors and windows were shut and locked tight. "What am I to do?" Arthur thought with a heavy heart. He honestly felt responsible that Kay had no sword. His brother had been looking forward to proving his honor on the fields. If he could not compete it, it would be Arthur's fault. As Arthur turned back toward the jousting arena, he suddenly remembered a sword he'd seen in the cathedral courtyard. "I'll just borrow it for a bit," he told himself. "After the tournament, I can return it." Arthur had only glimpsed the sword in the stone from a distance and had not read the inscription. He was concerned with only one thing: getting Kay a sword as quickly as possible, so he didn't pause to read the gold letters before placing his hand on the sword's hilt. The handle felt strange and familiar at the same time, and Arthur removed the blade from the stone in a single graceful movement. With a mighty sword in his grasp, Arthur raced off to the jousting fields. He found his brother at the south end and thrust the sword into his hands. When Kay looked down at the sword, his face turned as pale as a ghost. "Father," he whispered desperately to Sir Hector, "Father, this is the sword. I hold it in my very hands. It must be that I am the rightful king of all Britain." Sir Hector stared at the sword, then at his son, and finally at Arthur. "You must go back to the cathedral," he said quietly. Inside the cathedral, Sir Hector held a Bible before his son Kay. "Place your hand on this," he said, "and tell me how it is you came by the sword." Kay scowled as his cheeks grew red with shame, but he could not disobey his father. "Arthur brought it to me," he said quietly. Sir Hector turned to look at his fostered son. "Did anyone see you?" Hector asked. "I do not think so," Arthur replied. He was not sure what was going on, but had an uneasy feeling in his stomach. "I would like you to put it back," Hector said, and then drew it again.